Hello, everybody. Thank you to the GSA sponsors workshop on science communication. This will be a two-part workshop, so I'll start off by talking about writing science and share some of my experience writing and also perspective of an associate editor and reviewer. And then we'll get into how to communicate your science effectively through either conference presentations, public presentations, or posters. So my name is Rebecca North. I'm an associate professor at the University of Missouri in Columbia in the US, and I'm currently the chair of the CCC, which is the Committee for Inclusive Collaboration as part of GLION. So a lot of these slides were adapted from material produced by Emily Cavalier, Kehoe, Carr, Coles, and McDonnell, and others. And so it's an accumulation of slides over the years that we've all kind of rejigged and added to. And a lot of what I learned about science writing came from Jeff McDonnell, who wrote a blurb in Science where he had this quote, "A life of science is also a life of writing." And unfortunately, as associate professor, I've learned this is very true. I may have gotten into this field to do the field work and the fun, experiments and things, and I probably spend about 90% of my time writing. So it's something that you're going to have to deal with as a graduate student or an early career researcher. And it's better to kind of, train yourself from the very beginning and give yourself the tools to be able to do it effectively. There's lots of resources out there to help you with science writing. So Nature, the journal, has a few good resources. And then my favorite book that I hand all my graduate students and early career mentees when they start is called Writing Science, and it's by Joshua Schnell, How to Write Papers That Get Cited and Proposals That Get Funded. And I'll kind of summarize a few key points from that book, but I do recommend everybody read it thoroughly. I read it a few times every time I kind of, start to needing to get energized to be able to take on a writing task. So the key things that I'll be talking about today is how science and writing science is still storytelling. The whole goal of writing is to get people to read it and then to cite it. And so you want them to enjoy the experience. So that, does take some storytelling and some structure. There's a bit of a change, in recent years to switch from passive to active writing. And so active writing is, well, it's shorter, but it's also more engaging. And so kind of some tips to make sure you're writing from that perspective and in that voice. And then also grammar. So, really at the end of the day, your goal is for your reader, reviewer, whoever it is, not to make their head hurt. And so if they're really struggling to read what you've written, then they're not likely to, think positively about it. So make it as easy for them as possible. And then hopefully they'll have the time and energy to help you constructively with some improvements to your paper. So things that are unique to science writing relative to what you may have learned in an English class. Although it is, science and mostly composed of tables and figures, it is still about storytelling. And it's important to kind of keep that thread throughout. Effective scientific papers are interesting and useful, including newcomers to the field. And so you have to kind of understand who your audience is and write to them. So if it's a scientific journal article, you can use your jargon and talk, but if you're trying to write something more available to the public, then you need to keep that in mind. So scientific papers are for sharing your own original research and also for reviewing the research conducted by others. We're meant to move the field forward by building off of what came before. So they should be critical to the evolution of modern science in which the work of one scientist builds upon that of others. And so again, this is taken from nature.com, Writing Scientific Papers, and it's worth the read. So I'll start by kind of going over some common writing issues that I see a lot, as a reviewer, an associate editor, and also, of my own lab. One thing that is really difficult, I think, for early career researchers is to deal with this curse of knowledge. You're finally at the point where you understand your field and, you are the expert of your paper, you know it more than anybody else, and you want everybody to know everything that you know. And so this can be a little confusing for a reader. So to quote Shakespeare, ignorance is the curse of God, knowledge is the wing wherewith we fly to heaven. And so, knowledge is useful. That's why you're writing a paper, is to communicate that and to teach. But when you communicate, it can also be a burden if it's heavily weighed down with a lot of detail. And so this is the tricky part. Definitely when I write my papers, the first draft is 3 times longer than it needs to be. And so most of my writing time is actually editing time. And that is spent, cutting down these things and trying to get it so it's succinct and smooth. In science, less is more. And so it can take a while to kind of have that editing eye and get your work down to that point. So just a little comic, showing if you add too much detail, you can lose the process of communication. And so beware of jargon-filled sentences. So, your reviewers or your readers could be in any discipline. And so you want to make sure you don't lose them right from the beginning. So if you're going to use a lot of jargon, define it first. Sometimes it's helpful to have like an acronym table or something in there so they can keep up, especially if you're doing, a lot of models or things that have a lot of acronyms. Appropriateness, right? So you're trying to write to the audience that is reading it. So know kind of have an idea of their prior knowledge. Think about what journal you're submitting it to and what you want to kind of target in those readers. Less is more. So try to avoid overly complex sentences. And so if you can be done in a more simple, direct way, then go with that. So simple is usually better. So as I mentioned, a lot of, what's changing with time is the switch in writing science from passive to active speaking. And so again, this is coming from that Schmel Writing Science book. As an example, if you're using active language, and this comes from Stephen King, with the active verb, the subject of the sentence is doing something. And so for an example, it would be John called Jane. If this was written passively or from a passive language approach, something is being done to the subject of the sentence. So the subject is just letting it happen and is not actively engaged. So the same thing that we just said in an active way, if we were to say it in a passive way, the example would be Jane was called by John. You'll also notice in these two examples, the active writing is much shorter and more succinct. And so again, we want to make sure that we're saying as much as we can with as little words as possible. If you want to think it from a practical standpoint as well, a lot of journals charge per page. So literally, the more you write, the more you have to pay to communicate that to your readers. So that's, another advantage to using the active language is it's actually shorter. So passive language can get a bit cluttered and can be kind of clunky to read. But you do have to be careful not to sound too informal with your use of active language. So another example from the book Writing Science is the active form of this would be soil porosity influences water retention, whereas the passive approach would be water retention in soils is influenced by porosity. So again, you can see how it's a bit more clunky in the passive sense and definitely much longer. So sometimes if you're struggling with how to speak about this or which way to look at it, the subject of interest can determine which way is more appropriate. So in this example sentence, are we focusing on the soil porosity or are we more interested in the water retention? And that can help you to rephrase that possibly. Jack Jones was the editor of Inland Waters, and he always had some good advice that I like to continue on. So in writing, you want to tell your readers or them what they need to know, not what you know. And so again, this gets back to the curse of knowledge. So they don't need to know every single little detail of everything that went into that experiment, but they do need to know certain facts. So kind of differentiating between those is a skill. So tell them why you did it, not what you did. So again, writing to focus on those objectives and hypothesis and keeping your research questions in mind and upfront. I always recommend my students, write your research questions and tape them on a sticky above your laptop. And so every time you're getting down that rabbit hole of writing, kind of look up and see them and be like, am I writing to this anymore? And if you're not, then maybe it's time to regroup and start again. So another in line with this is tell your readers the time, not how you built the clock. And so, especially in the methods section, I find early career researchers can spend a lot of time in the details. And really, they just need to be able to get to the point and be able to have reproducible science. So some strategies for successful writing. And a lot of this material comes from Jeff McDonald's paper Writing Gone Hollywood, which was a communication science. So we need to find, some relevance. There's this interplay between what you want to say and what the readers are reading your paper to learn about or what they're interested in. And so finding this kind of middle ground or this relevance can be challenging. So one way to think about this is to use the word success, where we can make science interesting by making it simple, unexpected, concrete, credible, emotional stories. And so again, storytelling is a big piece of scientific writing. And, it's really intimidating to start off with like a blank page or a Word document where you're like, introduction, line 1. It's more good use of your time and helps to be more effective in your writing is to start off with kind of an outline or a storyboard or a pitch and then build out from there. So you can start out by thinking, what do we know about this subject that you're writing about? What is our gap in our knowledge? And so really what you're trying to do is place your research and your findings in that gap. So you have to, storytell to your audience, this is what we thought how this worked, but we really don't know how this particular mechanism works. And this is what this paper is going to tell you about. So how you're going to fill that gap. So again, this is the book, and I'll go through some examples and details about, structure and how to produce a good outline. Because without a good outline, you shouldn't be, perfecting sentences and worrying about grammar and things like that until you have like a path forward, until there's a plan for your writing. And so this is the suggestion to start with an outline. And so you can see here, it follows the line that we're typically accustomed to. So introduction, methods, results, and discussion. But you notice it's got this hourglass approach. And so you want to kind of start off really broad and what's, kind of the big picture. And then you can get into, more of the background information, the what came before or what we know about the subject. Then when you get into your methods and results, you're going to narrow in and focus specifically on, one particular lake or however approach you took to writing. And then you need to come back out and end your discussion just as broadly as you introduced it. And I find this happens a lot with early career writing is, you do a really good job on the introduction. It's all nicely framed. And then you just kind of run out of steam when it comes to the discussion. And you're so focused on the results that sometimes the discussion can read as just a reiteration of the results. And really your discussion should be, bringing in other studies, comparing your results to what we know in the literature and, moving the science forward in some way. So don't, kind of peter out when you come to the discussion section. That's actually the most important portion of the paper is interpreting those results. So this is a good idea. I always start my students off with a template, like a Word document, where these subheadings are already, in place. And so again, it's not just a blank Word document. You have something to work from and start off with these subheadings. So ecological concepts that encompass your work. And this is where you can just put in notes of what came before and some of that, historical knowledge on the subject and, kind of just follow through and making sure you don't skip a step and that you have a good plan and a good layout before you actually start the actual writing. So each section should be nested within a bigger section and it should, be bookended, right? So things that you talked about in your introduction, you should follow up in your discussion. Your research questions and your hypotheses are probably the most important part of your writing your paper. And so don't form research questions that you can't answer with your data. And also make sure that in your discussion, you answered your questions. And if you didn't, then maybe you have to rethink the question. Sometimes you have a plan and then as you get into it, you realize, oh, that's not quite how I want to phrase that. And you go back and forth. So it is definitely a very iterative with a lot of edits process. So in terms of structure, we can just go through it part by part here, starting off in the introduction. Again, this is kind of your opening. So it's your literature review or understanding of what came before. But along with the storytelling, we have to have an idea of what the story is about, right? So you're writing your introduction to set the stage for your results and the experiment that you did. And so whether your story is about phytoplankton or zooplankton or, physical lake mechanisms, you should start feeding that in right from the beginning in your introduction. Another thing that, Stephen King and they kind of talk about this writing science is we don't write detective novels, right? It shouldn't come as a surprise at the end, what the paper was about or what the key finding is. You want to nest that and kind of reiterate it, repeat it throughout the paper so that it's clear. In the introduction, you want to understand about the situation to follow the story. So if it's about temperature impacts on lakes, then you're probably going to want to have a paragraph about climate change, and how that's going to impact, future temperatures in lakes, things like that. So again, you're setting the stage or laying the groundwork to then put your, experimental or observational results in perspective. So what is the larger problem you're addressing, or what is the challenge? So what don't we know, and how are you filling this gap? So what do your characters, in this case, if they're phytoplankton or zooplankton, what do they need to accomplish? Or, what's the mechanism that you're trying to describe? And what specific questions are you proposing to answer? And so I always look, if I'm skimming through a paper, which by the way, most readers do. So, having things in places where people expect them, you're doing them a big favor. Again, you shouldn't, there is some originality in scientific writing, but in terms of structure and format, there is certain things we expect. And one of those is to see the objectives and hypotheses in the last paragraph of the introduction before you get into methods and results. And so making sure that that's where people can look for it, will help you, as this goes into review and people are providing comments, hopefully constructive comments on your writing. So moving on now to methods and results. This is, again, writing in the active voice. This is what you did. This is the action. So what happens to address the challenge? So, you want to find out if temperatures are increasing in lakes. And so your action was you measured temperature in lakes, and whether that was, multiple lakes or over time, this is where you're providing those details. So basically it's the work you did. And then when you get into the results component of it, you're telling people what happened. So there is, this storytelling nature to it. So this is kind of, the narrowing of this kind of hourglass approach. And so this is the nitty-gritty details. And then, as I mentioned, you have to remember to come out broad again, and just as broad, it should match, your introduction in terms of how you write your discussion. So this is where it all comes together, and you've probably just got into the weeds and statistical tables and things like that in your results. And so it's important, I like to see that the first paragraph of the discussion be kind of, a resolution, like, so what all these statistics told us was lake temperatures are changing, right? What's the big bullet point? What's the big take home message? So again, don't expect your readers are usually reading things, late at night, or they're skimming. And so they don't want to have to search really hard to find information. You should be upfront and bringing it to their attention. So in your discussion, you should start off with some kind of resolution, right? What did it all mean? What did you find? As mentioned, this is kind of the bookend to the introduction. So it should, if you talk about climate change in your introduction, then you should be talking about how this will change, in future climates in your discussion section. So the discussion connects with the introduction, and the funnel should be appropriately shaped. And as I mentioned, it should also match the scope. So however broad you start is how broad you should end. And then, another thing that I find kind of slips away, or you're rushing to finish the paper and just want to get it submitted in time, is taking the time to really sit back and form some conclusions. And so whether or not you have this as like a subsection in your discussion, or whether, it's just the last paragraph of the discussion, is you should have some overarching, what did you learn? How did you move the field of limnology forward? Reviewers and readers are going to be looking for this. And so ways to make your life easier as you're spending all this time, storytelling and outlining your paper, is the use of citation managers. And I think most of us use these nowadays. Lots of options available. But really, it's not a good use of your time to be going in and typing out all the names of, especially the Gleon papers that tend to have 50, 60 co-authors. So, making sure you're consistent with your referencing. As mentioned, readers, don't make their head hurt. And so if they're constantly, confused or seeing errors in your citations, although, it doesn't really matter to the science, it is showing, that maybe you're not taking the care or the polishing step in your manuscript that reviewers would like to see. So it does help to make sure that things are kind of smooth and consistent in that regard. So that's it for the presentation on writing science. I'm now going to give another presentation on science communication. And again, this is going to focus more on conference presentations and on making posters. Like we'll see a lot of Gleon posters with the poster session here at the virtual meeting. So in terms of science communication, it starts way before the night before you give your presentation. And so I think a lot of what we see in terms of presentations that may not be the best presentation you've ever seen could be improved by sufficient planning and preparation. And so, hopefully if you're presenting a poster at this conference, you started it weeks ago, it shows in your presentation if you've rushed and done it all the night before. So for early career researchers, just so you know, the average ratio of preparation time to delivery can range from 15:1 to 25:1. So that means if you're giving, let's call it an hour presentation, it will take you 15 hours to prepare that. So give yourself enough time to do it properly, because if you get nervous with public speaking, if you're not prepared, then that will make you even more nervous. And so one of the keys or the tips to kind of survive or feel more confident when you present is to be properly prepared and to have practiced it well in advance of giving the presentation, all of which things needs to happen significantly before you're giving it. And so part of this planning and preparation includes a literature review. So again, people are going to be coming up to your poster or asking you questions, and they're likely people that are reading, but then also writing the literature. And so having a broader understanding of where they're coming from or what's already out there is important, and again, will help you feel confident as you deliver this. You're going to have, obviously have your hands in your data. So have an understanding of what your data is showing, what the overall story is. And, there's lots of things that don't make it into the final presentation or poster. We probably make 50 figures and we show one. So kind of having an idea of that. So again, if you're asked a question, is there a relationship between this other parameter? You can say, yes, I looked at that, and no, there's not. That's makes you better prepared rather than saying, oh, I've never thought of that, or I haven't done that stat yet. The more prepared you can be, the better and smoother and the better you'll feel after you give your presentation. Just like kind of I talked about with writing, your talk should also have a plan and be organized and starting with an outline and then filling in the details. Again, you don't want to spend, hours and hours perfecting a figure and then realize that figure really isn't relevant to the story that you're telling. And, it ends up getting cut anyways. So start with a plan, know what relationships you want to show, and then get into the details of making your slides look pretty. Then also after you make your slides, as I mentioned, practicing your talk is pretty critical, and it really helps with your confidence when you go to finally present it. So as I said, you want to start with an outline. You really do have a pretty short period of time. You probably spent, at least a year collecting the data and analyzing it and writing it. And now you're meant to, summarize it all in, one poster presentation or a 12-minute talk. So you got to, really simplify everything, really boil it down to those overarching 1 or 2 take-home messages. And so when you start with an outline, you're able to kind of stay focused, and again, keeping those research questions forefront, effectively paced, and then on time. The best thing that you get out of presenting, in addition to sharing your research, is the opportunity to build from the questions that are asked or the comments that are made by your audience. And so if you don't have it well timed and you burn through your question period, you're really doing yourself a disservice because you're not getting the opportunity to get any feedback on that presentation. Oftentimes the questions will be really interesting, which will lead to follow-ups, and that will actually improve the final manuscript that comes out of this presentation. So make sure, it's effectively paced and on time, and that question period is really pretty important. I know a lot of students get nervous about it, and they're like, oh, great, if I can just, go over, then I won't have a question period. But as I said, I think you're doing yourself a disservice putting yourself in that position. So make sure you know how much time you have to give it and that you practice and make sure it fits within that time period. There's lots of different types of presentations we can give. And so knowing who the audience is the first step, right? So I prepare very different material if I'm lecturing to undergrads, or if I'm giving a public seminar, if I'm giving a departmental seminar to a bunch of limnologists, or I'm giving a conference presentation. So you want to kind of think like your audience and try to figure out what they want to hear, and that will help you frame what you're presenting to them. So if they're experts, you would need to provide less background. For example, if this is a talk at Gleon, you wouldn't need to define eutrophication. So you'll tend to have more data and more meat to that kind of talk. However, if it's a public presentation to non-scientists, you want to kind of speak broadly to their interest and not bog them down in highly detailed data. And so things that you can do is, if you're presenting a published manuscript, it's likely that you'll have really detailed X and Y axes with units. So an example of this is, you could have I work a lot with light data. And so my axis title would be, PAR, photosynthetically active radiation, with the units. But to the public, if you put that up, they might just be completely overwhelmed and caught up in the details of trying to figure out the units. And so oftentimes I'll take, published figures and just in PowerPoint, just put a little box over it and simplify my axis titles. And so that PAR with the units would just become light. And that's really, all the public needs to know to grasp what that figure is saying. So it's probably worth it to go through and replace your axis titles with more simple phrases. To try to, explain your work in terms of conceptual diagrams. And, this is becoming more and more popular in our science writing as well. And a lot of graphical abstracts are required for journal submissions. So it's probably worth the time early in your thesis to be able to make these conceptual diagrams, and you'll use them again and again and again. It's also helpful when talking to the public to use metaphors or analogies for what's happening in lakes. Helps them kind of connect with the material. And you want to have, lots of pictures, right? So lots of examples of what these things look like. As they say, a picture's worth 1,000 words. And I know, the modelers among us won't like this comment, but I think if you're giving it to a public audience, or at least, people that aren't directly in all the details of your field, try to avoid things like equations, because you either have to spend a significant amount of time explaining all the pieces of the equation and the parameters, and you're losing time to tell your overall overarching story. So yeah, try to keep it, text only, and avoid, complicated diagrams and equations. Depending on the size of your audience, if it's a larger audience, then you'll probably want to be a little more formal. But if it's a smaller group setting, then you can be less formal in how you present. And so kind of think about the characteristics of your audience. So what are their positions, roles, interests? Are they experts in your field, or is it worth taking the time to explain what eutrophication is before you launch into all the details? So be a bit jargon aware of your audience and what you think they want to hear, and try not to lose them along the way. A good book that I can recommend is called Escape from the Ivory Tower by Nancy Barron. So it's basically a guide to making your science matter, and kind of more tips like this on how to not lose the public audience when you're trying to talk about your science. And so think about, why the audience came to your talk and why they're there. Is it a course? Is it mandatory and to learn? Or do they need the information to be able to conduct a task? What do they want to hear? So, you want to give them what they came for. And so hopefully if you, in your title suggested you were going to talk about something, talk about that, but also make it interesting to keep them engaged. And so again, timing is critical, and you don't want to rush through your results section, which we've all seen happen at conferences. So again, that's the best part of your talk. That's what we're all there for. And so it's really unfortunate if you, didn't practice ahead of time and don't have the timing and are unable to spend the time on the results section, and then again, lose the opportunity to kind of summarize or provide that overarching message. So know the length of the presentation and the question period in advance, and time it appropriately. Everyone prepares their slides and speaks at different paces, so it's hard to give a real number on how many slides you need for your presentation, but general rule of thumb is usually 1 slide per minute. So if it's a typical conference, it's probably going to be a 12-minute presentation with 3 minutes for questions, which means you should have 12 slides. And so if you're preparing it and you're walking in and you have 40 slides, then you might, it will make you nervous, again, helping or hurting with that confidence component. But also, you're likely going to have to rush through things that you'd hope to be able to have time to present. So we also tend to, in papers and things, have these multi-panel figures. And so, yes, I think giving a presentation and writing a scientific paper are two different things. And so, I usually try to boil down like a multi-panel to like one figure. And so, it takes your audience, when you throw that figure up on that slide, even the most experts in the field among us are sitting there trying to figure out, okay, what's it showing? What are the axes? What do the symbols mean? They tend to be, kind of complicated. And so just making them do that once is helpful. Or if you have a theme, like different colors or different shapes represent different lakes, keep that theme consistent throughout your talk so your audience doesn't have to kind of rejig and figure out every time you throw up a new slide or figure. Sometimes we show these conceptual diagrams or, the food web diagrams that can be overwhelming with lots of arrows and boxes. So a nice way to kind of bring your audience along with you is to build them as you go through animations. So you could start off with like, if there's a food web, you could just start off with a picture of a lake. And so your audience is like, okay, I see a lake. And then you're like, okay, in a lake, we have primary producers. And then, throw up the box and the arrow for the primary producers and talk about that. And then, have another slide in which you add another component of that animation and keep moving it forward so that you're building that complicated food web diagram with your audience and not just throwing it at them at once and then having them try to kind of figure it out as you go. We want to minimize our text, and so try to keep it to bullets only. Ideally, text should be one sentence, one line. So try to avoid having paragraphs and things in your presentation. Nobody's going to be reading it in that level of detail. Also, people, get distracted during presentations and they're checking their phones and their messages and their email. And so if they look down and they look back up at your presentation, they should be able to figure out what you're talking about and where you are in your talk. And so to help them do that, it's helpful to have titles. So, here my title is Let's Talk About Time. So every slide that you present should have a title, and that kind of helps to orient the audience as to what you're talking about. It also helps to understand the setting, right? So if this is a presentation virtually or in person, if it's a conference in person, I always try to go into that room and see somebody else present before it's my turn. And in there, I'm watching, okay, how are they tracking the time? Is it the red light, green light scenario? Where is the microphone? Could I wear like a headset and walk around, or am I stuck behind a podium? Trying to figure these things out ahead of time and having a plan for how you're going to present, again, really helps you to be prepared and helps with the nerve minimization. So, figure out if you need the microphone, think about obstacles that can trip you, where is that cord and how do I avoid, falling flat in my face during a presentation. Thinking about where your body is going to be relative to the audience and the screen so that you're not turning your back to the audience. If you can, and so that's a good idea for early career to know that before you have your session, you should be going into the room. And so whether it's the coffee break or the lunch break or the morning, introducing yourself to the session chair, because they're probably nervously wondering if all their speakers showed up. So as opposed to quietly sitting in the audience, go up, introduce yourself, have a look at your slides, make sure everything looks okay. You can test the audio, just make sure you have a feel for the room and for the materials available to you. And then again, thinking about what that audience is and what they want to hear about. So what's the objective? Are you there to teach? Are you presenting research? Is it for entertainment purposes? So in terms of your objectives, you want to kind of keep it focused so that your audience knows what they're there to hear about and are looking to you to answer that research question you posed. And it also helps you to keep on task and on subject. So try to reduce a complicated message into manageable portions for both the presenter and the audience. And so think about, kind of that elevator pitch approach or ways to kind of simplify things without a lot of jargon. So I always say it's a good idea if you can to practice your presentation with your family or your roommates, people who are non-scientists, and see if they can understand what you're talking about and or where you lose them. And if so, try to keep that as simple as possible. And so the best presentations are those that appear natural and spontaneous. So it's never the same way twice. And so, yeah, try to avoid, having cue cards or any kind of notes or script, because what will typically happen is you'll just read that. So your timing will probably be good. But you'll lose your audience because you'll just be monotone and they'll not be engaged with you because you're just kind of reading out something that's written in front of you and you're probably not making eye contact with them. So never script your presentation and read it. You can have notes, oh, this is the slide where I talk about this, or this is, remember to make this point when I show this figure. Those are fine, and they'll help to prompt you. But yeah, try to avoid, word by word memorization. It does not appear natural nor engaging. So I've talked about practice a lot. I think it's important. In my lab, we try to have lab meetings where everyone practices their presentations ahead of time. We practice the question period, right? So if you've thought of something before, then you can go and look it up, or you're at least not as surprised and thrown off guard when you're trying to come up with an answer. And so, yeah, it's really helpful if you can think of all the questions you might be asked ahead of time and just even think through all your answers as opposed to kind of stuttering and being caught unawares when you do get asked a question. So after you create your presentation, you want to practice it for what you'll say for each slide. It is helpful to practice it out loud. That will just help with the pace. It helps you to be more comfortable. Sometimes I'll, record myself, which I know is horrible. But it also helps us to identify any kind of, habits we have or twitches, or you can hear for yourself how many times you say in a given sentence. We all have our things that we know we do. And, if you follow the mantra of like, know better, do better, if you're aware that you have a habit, then you can do what you can to regulate it or, mitigate it. So for example, I am very aware that I speak too quickly. And so oftentimes when I'm giving a presentation, all I'm saying in my head is slow down, slow down, slow down. Right. And sometimes I achieve that and sometimes I do not. But knowing what those things are for you and kind of, being aware of them can help you to try to minimize them when you give talks. And so in terms of content, again, posing those objectives or research questions and making sure that everything ties back to them throughout the course of your presentation. You want to make sure that your content and the figures that you choose to present achieve your objectives, that they're clearly understood, that they're interesting, right? So, I always say there's no point in showing a graph if there's no relationship. Because there's nothing there, no relationship is no relationship and doesn't need to be illustrated. So thinking clearly about which figures you're showing and why, that it's appropriate type of presentation, and that you're not overloading your audience with material. And so there's, again, with this is helping with the structure and the outline to make sure you have a plan. And if you follow the plan, then you should achieve all the things that I'm talking about. So your title is the reason most often people are at your talk. So we do have abstract books commonly, but only if you're really, really interested in something do you actually read the abstract, or at least that's the case for me. So most of the time I'm picking the talks I go to based on their title. So spend a lot of time thinking about your title. It should arouse interest, right? It should be kind of exciting, but it should also be, very clearly what you're going to talk about. So again, we have to submit our titles and our abstracts well in advance. And so again, a nice title is one that has the major conclusions or the results in it. So having, a feel for your data and knowing what those results are when you submit your abstract and your title, you're doing yourself, the best ability to give a good talk later on. Oftentimes, people have an outline, which I think is great, but the outlines that read, I'm going to first do my methods or my introduction, and then my methods, and then my results, listing them in that way is not really that effective. We all know how that goes, and that's what we expect out of a scientific talk. So instead, I'd recommend, telling them what you're going to tell them. So, first I'm going to talk about how climate change is impacting lakes. And then for my methods, I'll talk about our long-term historical data set, and then I'll show you how temperatures are increasing. So give all the information right there in the outline, and so people know what's coming. And then you're spending the rest of the talk providing the evidence for what you kind of outlined at the beginning. And every talk and every poster should have clearly defined objectives and hypotheses. We know that conferences and especially poster sessions can be really overwhelming. And so if I'm scanning through and walking, quickly past a series of posters, I'm scanning for the box or the bolded message that says objectives, and I'm reading that. And then I'm looking towards the end to see the overall conclusions. And then if it's something that interests me, then I go up to the poster and engage with the person presenting and get into the details. So don't make it hard for them to find that information. And putting it where, yeah, people expect to see it also helps. The same with the scientific writing. So when you're giving your presentation or your poster, you want to kind of grab their attention at the beginning. So make them walk over to your poster or stick around for your talk. The middle tends to be, the meat of your research, and this is where most of your figures are. And then, yeah, remember, it's still that hourglass approach, just like I talked about with writing science. So at the end, you want to conclude with a review of your talk. And then, if you have time, talk about where you're going next. It's also nice to kind of preempt maybe some of the questions that are coming in the question period. And so, if it's obvious that you now need to do an experiment to figure out this, just say that, because otherwise in your question period, someone's going to have their hand up and say, have you thought about? And then you want to say yes. It also helps. As I said, I tend to prepare more material than I use. And so often at the end of my talk, I'll have a bunch of slides that I cut. So I recommend keeping those in there, especially, figures or things. And so that if someone does ask during the question period, it's pretty awesome if you can pull into that end thing and say, why, yes, I have thought about that relationship, and here it is, right? And be able to talk about it that way. I mean, there's no way you can anticipate every question you're going to get, but it is pretty rewarding if you can think of it ahead of time and show the answers, in a slide fashion. So at this point, when you're giving this talk on your scientific research, you are the expert, right? You know the material of your thesis or paper or whatever it is better than anyone else. So the focus should be on you and not your slides. So the slides are there to help as tools to help prompt you to what to talk about. But don't forget that the focus is there on you. So as with teaching and a lot of other public speaking things, again, people are not always paying attention. They tend to be skimming. And so it's a good kind of mantra to tell them what you're going to tell them. And you can do this with your title and with your outline slide, and then tell them, right? Provide the evidence, and then tell them what you told them. And so summarize it at the end and give them that bullet or that take home message that really is what you want them to remember and retain, weeks after the conference. So try to make it as engaging and as visually appealing as possible. So just like with writing, don't make their brain hurt. When you think about your typical conference setting, if it's an oral presentation, most people are seeing about 10 to 15 per day for 5 days. So, have something in yours that makes it stand out and keeps them engaged. And, posters, most conferences, the poster session is in the evening after seeing 10 to 15 talks. And a lot of them have a bar and tend to be a little more social. So again, if you want people to come over to your poster and engage in it, it needs to be kind of simple. If it looks really complicated or there's this giant formula or something in the middle, someone has had a few beers may not be willing to spend the time trying to figure out exactly what you're trying to convey. So make it simple. Another thing that I think we've all seen is someone will give talk and they'll throw up a figure and they'll stand back and look at it and be like, huh, well, that's really interesting. Like, it looks like this is happening. And try to avoid interpreting your data on the fly. In theory, you've made these talks and presentation, figures ahead of time, and you've thought hard about what the data is saying, and now you're telling your audience it. Try to avoid, looking at it for the first time with your audience and then trying to sort it out on the fly. If you are nervous, try to, fake it till you make it. If you portray confidence, then people will believe you and listen to you. So try to start by being upbeat and project confidence. I've seen lots of people at conferences get up and before they even start their talk, they're like, oh, I'm really sorry. I threw this together the night before. This is really unorganized. Here we go. And no one's really keen at that point to join them on that journey. So, try to avoid making excuses or acting negatively. Fake it till you make it and pretend that this is the best talk you've ever given, even if you did make it up the night before. So don't apologize for being underprepared. And so there's a good book and a good, kind of TED Talk by Randy Olson called Houston, We Have a Narrative. And it kind of talks about how science needs a story. And so in science, when we give presentations, we tend to do this and thing, right? So, here's one figure and another figure and the stats that go with it. And in that process, we lose the narrative. And so there's a really simple thing that he's proposing that we could all employ to better communicate our science, and that's the ABT framework. So and, but, and therefore. So as you're showing these figures and proving your point, you're saying, and, here's a figure showing this, but what we still don't understand is how this relates to that. Therefore, we need more studies on this subject or something to that effect. So, kind of think about your research question and your presentation and see if you can put in this and, but, therefore context. As I mentioned, it's somewhat helpful to record and even sometimes video record yourself giving a presentation, because there's lots of things about our appearance that can be distracting. And so if you know better, you can do better. So try to be aware of annoying habits. I personally don't wear jewelry when I'm presenting because I know I'll spend my whole time playing with a necklace or fiddling with a ring. So try to, not have things in your pocket or keys that you're jingling while you're presenting. Try not to, play with your hair. Try to pick an outfit that has the least accessories or things that could go wrong. In terms of posture, just try to be aware of it. Don't slouch, stumble, or look down. Try to make eye contact with your audience and engage them and look at them directly. If you can, I would suggest getting a microphone to allow you some flexibility when you're talking. So try to avoid being stuck behind a podium. So try to get out from underneath it and walking around, and that will keep your audience kind of awake and engaged as they're watching you walk around the stage. And then also, finish poise. So you don't want to kind of collapse in this relief of having just finished your presentation and being, kind of this giant dash to the finish line. Try to act professional and poised from start to end. In terms of delivery, and again, this would help if you recorded it or had some feedback. With our lab meetings and our practice presentations, we also submit anonymous feedback. And so this is where you can tell your office mate that, hey, you say after every sentence, or something to that effect, so that people are aware that they do these things and can try to avoid them. So in terms of delivery, try to make your voice natural and relaxed as much as you can. And that's why it's also good not to script it, because it's easier to sound natural if it's not scripted. You should try to speak more slowly than normal. Believe it or not, this is slow for me. But vary the speed to emphasize or excite. So you don't want to appear monotone. You want to kind of use speed and pitch and tone to be able to emphasize key points. So don't shout, project at your normal voice, but again, altering that volume can be used to get attention and to highlight your points. And so use your voice, it's a tool. So use it effectively to communicate your science. Try to keep your pitch low, it shows confidence, and vary it to emphasize key points. There is something that I've gotten as feedback before in presentations, is that I end a sentence with an indentation. So it almost sounds like you don't know what you're talking about. Like lakes are turning warmer. And, just that inflection or upspeak at the end of the sentence, kind of indicates that you're asking, not telling. And, it can show that you're not confident in what you're saying. So now that I'm aware that I do have that habit, I do try to avoid it. But you can all tell me how many times I did it in this talk. And pauses, right? So it is hard to slow down once you're going. That's why I like building slides, with the conceptual diagrams or things, or having it so that, your points come up one by one. Anything you can do to build into your talk the opportunity for pauses is effective, because that gives the audience time to think about what you're showing them and reflect on major points. This is particularly important when you're showing figures, because as I mentioned, you throw the figure up there and your audience is spending at least a second or two just orienting themselves to the figure and trying to figure out what it's saying. And they're not even listening to what you're saying about the figure at that time. So that would be a good opportunity to include a pause while they're trying to orient themselves to your figure. As I mentioned, eye contact is important. And so, try to at least appear that you're looking out across your audience. I'm trying to look into the camera on my laptop here. You want to kind of keep your hand gestures within the box, they say. And on a virtual meeting, that makes it easier. But try to, avoid wild gestations and things that are kind of going off in all angles. Your hands are another tool. They can be important to emphasize a point, and just try to keep your movements kind of controlled, simple, and within the box. I guess along with the fake it till you make it, smile even if you feel like you're going to puke. So try to, cover everything with a smile. It'll be more likely that your audience will be with you and engaged and happy to attend your presentation if you at least look like you're having a good time. So again, with the posture, standing up straight, avoiding distracting mannerisms, making sure the audience can see the screen. So again, that's, orienting your body in a way that you're not standing in front of it. And so maybe moving around would help, because in some situations it's really hard where the conference is set up to not stand in front of it for somebody. And it's also helpful, I find, to engage with the media they're looking at. So if you're, reading your notes off a laptop, but they're looking at the screen behind you, it's more effective to turn around and look at what they're looking at and talk about it with them, as opposed to looking at a screen on a computer that they can't see. So try to engage with what they're looking at. If you're going to use a laser point, use it effectively. So use it only when you're trying to make a point or show, a dot on a figure or something. You don't need it to kind of follow along with every word you're saying. It'll lose its effectiveness if you're constantly using it. So use it if you need it, but only when you need it. And as I said, try to move around if you can. Podiums are where presentations go to die. So as I mentioned, question period is almost the best part of the talk, because that's where you get feedback that you can, incorporate and makes your science stronger. So little things that help with that is to listen carefully and repeat the question that is asked. Nowadays with Zoom and stuff, this is really important for your online audience. But it's also demonstrates that you understood the question because you were able to reframe it. And it also buys you some time so that you can think about the answer, right? So although, it may be kind of annoying to sit there and hear every question twice, use that as a tool to be able to come up with an answer. Answer questions in a straightforward manner as you can and be honest. Don't talk about things you don't know. Just talk about what your data can tell you and try not to have too much conjecture. Try not to be condescending to the question asker or treat it like it's stupid. And this again can help to repeat the question, because maybe you can rephrase it in a way that allows you to answer it a little more objectively. And if you don't know the answer, or if we, like, the field, the limnologists don't know the answer, just say so. Don't try to, fake it or make up things. Because again, most of the time at a conference, people in the audience know what's in the literature and what is known and is not known. And so, yeah, just try to be honest about what you've read and what you understand things to be. Definitely don't argue, even if the question asker is coming at you aggressively. Don't engage them in that behavior. It doesn't, nobody enjoys being in that room at that time. So if it's getting argumentative, just agree to disagree. You can suggest that, oh, let's have this conversation later during coffee break where we can get into more of the details. Try to kind of circumvent any kind of argumentative behavior in a question period. And as I mentioned, it does help to have extra slides for anticipated questions and just, shows how prepared you are. So most of the time when we're giving our presentations or our posters, we're using PowerPoint. So being comfortable with that, I find it really helpful to start with a template as opposed to a blank screen or a page. And so, ask around my lab, we have a shared drive, and every time someone gives a talk or a presentation, they put it in there. And so, you can change it. You'll change the color scheme. You obviously change the content, but just starting with a template, at least for a poster, can be really helpful and save a lot of time. Be aware of color blindness. And so, you want things in as many contrasting ways as possible. So for example, if you're showing a figure and you want to show two different lakes, you could have them as different colors, but in addition, it would be helpful to have them as different shapes as well. So those that are colorblind will be able to differentiate and see that. Tables are really difficult to look at and interpret during a talk. So here, tables are talk deaf. If you can show it in a figure, I think it's more effective. If it is in a table, then this is maybe where you want to use your animations and put a red circle or something around one, number in a table that you really want to draw the audience's attention to. But considering it's going to be up for, a couple of seconds, it's pretty unlikely that anyone's going to get anything informative out of like a stats table, for example, in a talk. If you're getting a poster, again, don't make their brain or their eyes hurt. So try to make things, well aligned, use rulers, minimize text. No one's going to read a paragraph on a poster. So try to keep it to bullets only. And try to focus your large main figures kind of in the middle. That's the, the key takeaway thing that you want them to see. Make it big and make that right there where it's not hard to find. So if you're giving a presentation, as I mentioned, you want to kind of have outline slides. And so I usually start my presentation with, okay, this is my outline. This is where I talk about my methods. This is the figure showing the relationship between this and this. This is my scaled up figure. And this is my final conclusion slide, right? And then you fill it in once you have that outline there. So making sure you have these anchor slides and things that keep people on track. When you can, replace text with images or conceptual diagrams. And if you ever are in a talk and you start by explaining a slide saying, I know you can't read this, but maybe that slide shouldn't be part of a presentation, right? So, try to take the time to simplify, as I mentioned, different axes, titles, whatever it takes to make that a little more, because there's no point in wasting one of your 12 slides on something, the audience can't read. So be aware of that. So just to kind of wrap up here, using this blog from Nature, David Letterman countdown to the 10 biggest pitfalls in scientific presentations. So this is what not to do in a scientific presentation. So number 10, do not rush through all your slides no matter what. So talking faster is not a good response to time constraints. And so, yeah, if someone says, oh, I'm going to have to speed up to get through my slides, then it's likely they're not listening to anything you say from that point forward. So try to formulate a strategy to deal with time issues. If, it's really important to try to end in that, kind of hourglass approach. So if you're running out of time and you have 5 more figures to show, it's probably better use of your time to skip to that main conclusion slide where you kind of synthesize it all. You send them home with those take-home messages. And then, if you had questions or whatever, that's where you can get into showing the rest of the results. All right, number 9, thing not to do for a scientific presentation. Do not leave time for discussion. So as I mentioned, the key advantage is getting the audience's reaction. And so don't miss this opportunity. So try to plan, have an outline, practice, and that will help you avoid kind of burning through your question period. Number 8, not doing dry runs. So as I mentioned, it helps with everything, with confidence and kind of, enjoyment from the audience's perspective if you've practiced it. So practice with tough, honest critics. Every time you do it, you'll reveal problems that you'll be aware of and try to avoid doing the next time you give it. So more iterations are always helpful. And so it also helps you to streamline or kind of edit and cut down some things. If you find you're not really talking about this particular slide, then maybe cutting it would be helpful. This is part of the editing process. Number 7, not understanding what can and can't be achieved. So don't overwhelm your audiences with data in an effort to prove your results. A presentation is like a commercial or a highlight reel of your research. Either you've already or you will soon be publishing this as a manuscript, and that is where all the details can go. The presentation or the poster is just, that, 2-second video on what it is that you found. So, it's your opportunity to tell your story, to inspire collaboration, to evoke questions, and to encourage other scientists to learn more about your work. So leave all the nitty-gritty details and the proof to journal articles and replication of results. Number 6, do not use journal article graphics. So as I mentioned, You don't want to use things exactly from the journal because they often have complicated axes, definitions, require a lot of explanations, or they're multi-panel. So you want to try to, not redo, but even just simplify figures for the purpose of presentations and posters. Number 5, don't try to surprise the audience. So as I mentioned, this is not a detective novel. You don't have to build towards unexpected conclusions. Your science is already pretty complex, and there's only likely a few people in the audience that are really have done similar things before, are with you on all the details. And so, that narrative is more important than the specifics. So, as I said, tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them, and make sure that at the end of it, they remember what you talked about and that take-home message is clear in their minds. Number 4, failing to develop insightful visualizations. So again, data tables, equations, these things are all necessary and fine in a journal article, but they really don't come across well, or it takes too long for the audience to grasp them in a presentation or poster format. So every slide should have an overarching message, and that should be supported by your visuals. And so, if you're in a publisher you already have, they'll just believe what you're saying. So if, your title says, lakes are getting warmer, then that's what the audience is going to come away with, that lakes are getting warmer, not the detailed, figure proving that. So an interesting audience member can always look at your raw data later, or, now we can use QR codes and things on our presentations and posters where they can get links to the papers or, all the complicated tables and figures if that's what you want to share. So number 3, biggest pitfall is not understanding how hard it is to gauge your audience. And so I started off saying, kind of know your audience. But again, they have varied expertise and you don't always know who will attend. So again, try to figure out who's going to be there and try to reach that group of people. So make sure that your overall story and structure would work for who you expect to be in the audience, even if some of the details are better for experts. Number 2, failing to put yourself in the audience's shoes. So most people hate complicated slides, but you tend to keep presenting them. And so, as you're an audience member and, in that presentation before your presentation, trying to figure out how the logistics work, think about what you're getting from them and what you hear when they're speaking. So the presenter, knows what slide's coming up next, what part of the slide is critical, and can read all the fonts. And so, you're going to smooth over or not see a lot of things that your audience is seeing, which is why it's really helpful to do practice presentations and get feedback before you go to the conference. So the number 1 mistake a presenter can make is thinking a collection of slides is enough. So your 50 slides may allow you to talk for 50 minutes, but it doesn't mean that you have anything to say, and definitely nothing to be, taken from that presentation. So always have a plan with an overarching scientific question and narrative. Slides can fragment even the most coherent story, so make sure that each slide supports the narrative. Back to the writing, a Stephen King book, one of the advice is kill your darlings. And it's something that I follow a lot because you can spend a lot of time either writing, the perfect paragraph or making the perfect figure, and that is your darling. But when you go to use it and put it in, you're like, this doesn't quite work. Like it's, I'm spending too much time having to explain it. And so sometimes you have to kill your darlings. If it makes you feel better, I have a darling cemetery. So a folder on my C drive where I just kind of throw in, all the text. Maybe later on I can use it in a grant proposal or, something else, or that beautiful figure that, could be great in another context, even if it didn't work for what you were originally creating it for. So again, the presentation is about the presenter, which is you, and not about your collection of slides. And so that's it. Unfortunately, with this virtual format, I can't answer questions right now, but I will be there for the workshop open question period, and I'm happy to address any questions you have. And I'm looking forward to reading all those wonderful scientific papers and to listening to all your great presentations. Thank you.